Hi there. This is Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. I've got an amazing story today. It's a modern miracle, and I hope the Spirit will confirm to you the truth of it as it has to me. It's a great story. I've been a Varsity Scout leader for probably 20 years of my life, so I can really relate to this story. Aaron Hansen was the Varsity Scout leader in Ely, Nevada in 2004. And three of Ruben and Esperanza Perez's sons were in his group. They were planning a water activity down to Lake Mead. Aaron had a boat, a little runabout, and they planned the trip. Noe was a real good leader with the young men, and he helped his Varsity Scout leader plan this trip. Ruben told me that he had been praying for one of his sons. Noe was a very faithful young man. Another of his sons, Moroni, was struggling a little. They had invited one of Moroni's friends, Casey, he was a non-member, to go on the trip with them. Another adult leader, Dave Jacobson, had agreed to help, and it's a lot of work getting all that kind of equipment. Just going on a boating activity without scouts is a lot of work. But they got the boat ready, they got all the fuel, they got all the food, they got all the tents and the bags and the equipment, and the boys and the moms ready. And you have to get the moms ready for the boys to leave. And then they had to take a 5-hour drive down to Lake Mead from Ely. They launched from the Logandale Marina and then went about 20 or so minutes around outside the marina and found a big stretch of beach, and there was no one else camped there. The next morning, my daughter Courtney and her husband Ryan arrived at the lake with their boat. They had some friends, Brooke and Travis, and they also had their son Dodge and Brooke and Travis's daughter Sailor with them. And as they pulled out of the marina, the lake was like glass. And Travis and Ryan thought it was going to be great wakeboarding. But they had my 4-year-old grandson Dodge on Ryan's lap, and he was driving the boat, and Sailor and Dodge won the conversation, and so they decided they'd go on the beach and play for a while. Lake Mead's beaches are beautiful. It's fine brown sand, and the water tapers out from ankle deep to knee deep, and about the time you get shoulder depth, there's a shelf in the sand, and it just drops off. And so they had to keep an eye on the kids who were playing at the edge of the water as the boys set up the canopy and the chairs and were just enjoying a beautiful, calm morning at the lake. That same morning, Aaron and Dave, the two Varsity Scout leaders, had gotten up, and they thought, we're going to be towing boys all day long on the boat. Look at that water. And they decided they would sneak out, just the two of them, for a minute and do a little wakeboarding on their own. And when they returned, they loaded up all the boys they could get in the boat, but they couldn't get the whole group in. So they left 3 of the boys on the beach: Noe, Casey, and Brian. Casey was floating on a air mattress just a little ways offshore, just enjoying himself, and Noe grabbed a big handful of red vines licorice and started to chew on it, and then decided he would wade out into the water and join his friend on that air mattress. Noe couldn't swim. As Noe waded out into the water, his licorice started to get wet. So he stuffed a huge mouthful of red vines into his mouth, as much as he could hold, and was trying to chew on it. He got out to the air mattress, and he and Casey draped their arms over the air mattress and were enjoying floating in the warm Lake Mead water. The water in Lake Mead is a brown color. It's Colorado River water, and it kind of looks like real thin chocolate milk. It's opaque. But as boats go up and down the channel, waves come in, and one of these waves hit the boys. Noe was knocked off the raft. As he came up, he gulped for air, and water came into his mouth, and it shoved all of this licorice down his throat and clogged his throat. Casey didn't know that Noe couldn't swim, And he thought he was just monkeying around because he was thrashing and gulping and coughing and trying to catch his breath. And then suddenly, Noe disappeared under the water. Casey watched. He waited. He didn't come back up. After a minute, Casey realized this is not a joke, and he began to dive. He went into emergency mode and started searching for his friends, waving his arms frantically in the darkness of the brown water, but he couldn't find anything. The second time he surfaced after diving, he yelled into shore and he told Brian, "You need to run down the beach and get help." My son-in-law wrote his memories just a month after the experience. And these are some of the things he shared. He said, when Brian got to us, it was obvious there was something wrong, but he couldn't seem to say anything other than that he needed to get out to the scout leader's boat to talk with them. I could tell he was uncomfortable. He seemed a little shy, so we told him to jump in the boat and I'd give him a ride. We motored out around the point of the beach that hid their boat from our view and sped towards them. They had a scout in the water behind their boat when we arrived. Brian was sitting in the bow of my boat, and he yelled to them as we pulled up, "Noe is gone." The scout leaders quickly dragged the scout out of the water into the boat and sped towards camp. We followed moments behind. Casey continued to dive, and then he stopped to catch his breath and surveyed the surface. There was no sign of his friend. No bubbles, no licorice, nothing. And he realized time was passing and this was getting really, really serious. So he dove down till his lungs felt they would burst, waving his arms frantically in the darkness, and nothing. He came up, caught his breath again, and decided he had to dive deeper. This time he dove till his ears started to ache and his lungs were ready to burst. And as he was waving his arms, groping in the darkness, he brushed something with his fingers on one hand. And he thought, was that grass? That could have been hair. And so he ignored the screaming of his lungs and the aching of his ears, and he kicked deeper and pulled deeper, and he tapped Noe's head. He kicked one more time and grabbed him around the arm and then started to fight for the surface. Meanwhile, Courtney and Travis had run down the beach. They got to the scout camp and were watching as Casey dove frantically into the water. When they saw Casey begin to drag Noe's body in, Travis ran out into the water to meet him and help bring Noe's body to shore. When they laid him on the beach, Noe was unconscious. He was blue, and his eyes had rolled back in his head. Meantime, the two scout leaders were speeding back to camp. And the Varsity Scout leader leapt out of his boat before they even got to shore and started fighting to shore. Brian, the scout in my son-in-law's boat, jumped out and swam into shore. When Aaron, the Varsity Scout leader, arrived at shore, he knelt down next to Noe's body and put his hands on his head and said, "Noe, come back." Aaron took over the CPR and Travis continued to assist, but nothing happened. Ryan turned his boat and sped towards the marina to notify the rangers that they had to call for an ambulance and a lifelight because the scout had drowned. And this is what he says as he returned. It had been about 25 minutes since Noe had disappeared under the brown water of Lake Mead. As I sped back towards the scout camp, returning from the marina, I remember thinking, this will be an incredible experience for those other young men. To see their friend revived, I was astonished when I returned. He had not yet been revived. The atmosphere was incredibly somber. And then he says this. Not knowing if this group was LDS, I asked the leaders, have you administered to him? They indicated they had not because they did not have any consecrated oil. I told them they needed to give him a blessing right now without oil. Dave one of the scout leaders put his hands on Noe's head and anointed his head without oil. And as he did, Aaron, the Varsity Scout leader, looked over, and all the boys were kneeling prostrate on the sand with their faces in their hands, almost kneeling in the sand. They were sobbing and pleading and praying and begging the Lord to spare their friend Noe. After he was anointed, Aaron put his left hand on Noe's head. And then he raised his right arm to the square and said, "Noe, I command you to live." Describing that moment, Ryan said, "I had started doing CPR on Noe while the two leaders laid their hands on his head. I had just given him a few breaths and paused for a moment when Aaron Hansen said, 'I command you to live.' The very next second, Noe took a breath on his own. I cannot explain the miraculous feeling of leaning over Noe and seeing this take place. The atmosphere changed immediately. The Spirit was extremely powerful at that moment. Noe continued to struggle breathing on his own. His breath was sporadic, and his pulse was weak. Just 1 minute later, a fellow from the marina pulled up on a jet ski. He quickly took over. I went back to my boat, and we carefully loaded Noe onto the rear platform. Aaron Hansen, the Varsity Scout leader, jumped on board with Noe's brothers, Moroni and Adden. We sped back to the marina to be closer to the ambulance and Lifelight when it arrived. At this point, Noe's breathing was labored and shallow, but he was breathing on his own. He was still unconscious and was not responding to verbal or visual stimulus. Meanwhile, back in Ely, Nevada, Noe's parents were at home. Ruben had joined his wife Esperanza for lunch. And suddenly, while they were eating, a friend just showed up, Carolyn Harridan. She was Jonathan's mother, and he was on the trip with their sons. And she kept telling Ruben, "No, don't go back to work yet. You need to stay." And Ruben was quite anxious because he had to get back to work. And then the phone rang. And the authority told him, "Your son has been involved with a really bad water accident." And Reuben assumed that it was Moroni, his son, and that the Lord has answered his prayers to give him an Alma the Younger experience. And then the authority clarified, "No, it's Noe." Reuben thought, "I've got to get to the hospital." They told him that Noe was being lifelighted to the Sunrise Hospital in Las Vegas. So Reuben called his boss, Brian Reed, and told him he couldn't come back to work. He had to drive to Las Vegas because Noe was being lifelighted to the hospital. And Brian wisely said, "Let me drive." So they took Brian's truck and they drove to Las Vegas. While they were rolling, 5 hours, worried sick, not knowing what had happened, about the time they were going through the White River Narrows, Esperanza called her husband, and she said, "Noe was floating on a raft, and he sunk into the lake. He can't swim." Casey dove repeatedly and was able to pull him out of the water, but he didn't breathe for a long time. Aaron commanded him to live, and Noe took a breath, but he's struggling to breathe. And Reuben told his wife, "Esperanza, Noe will be okay. When I get to the hospital, I will command him to rise, and he will." Meanwhile, back at the lake, Aaron, the Varsity Scout leader, had taken Noe's brothers, Moroni and Aaron, to the hospital. And Dave, the other scout leader, had to go back and break down camp. My daughter and their group helped him, and they loaded all the gear in the 2 boats and took the rest of the scouts and the other scout leader, and they drove home to Ely. It must have been a hard, somber drive for those scouts and that leader. Meanwhile, Noe lay unconscious in the hospital. He was on a respirator. He had IVs sticking in him. And Reuben came rushing in. The doctor identified him as Noe's father and took him to the side with Aaron, the scout leader. And he said, Noe is in a coma. This is not a good situation. There's not much hope. He didn't have oxygen to his brain for a long time. I doubt he will live, but if he does, he'll be a vegetable the rest of his life. And Reuben looked at the doctor and said, I will command him to get up, and he will. And the doctor rolled his eyes and said, do your best. And he left the room. Reuben looked at Aaron and he said, that is man's opinion, not God's opinion. Reuben knew he had to give his son a blessing. He was ready. He was gathering his courage and his faith. He asked his boss, Brian Reed, to administer the anointing oil. As Brian administered that consecrated oil, a voice came into Reuben's mind very clearly and said, he will wake in 24 hours. So Reuben took courage, and he pronounced that blessing on his son and told him that he would wake in 24 hours. Then time passed. An hour, 2 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. And then Reuben said he had what he called a true Lamanite murmuring moment. And suddenly he began to ask, why Noe? Noe is my lamb. He's my gentle son, my good son. Moroni needed the help. Why Noe? He murmured and thought, I just don't know. And then a voice came into his mind and said, remember, he will wake in 24 hours. And Reuben, still struggling, said, I need a sign. Moments later, the second counselor of the Green River Stake of Nevada walked in, and he came up to him and said, your son will be okay. Reuben excused himself and went into the bathroom and knelt down and pled with the Lord to forgive his doubting and his moment. We all have those feelings as we struggle through time and we're being tested. After 21 hours, the nurse came in and told Reuben, you're going to be here a long time, and you may as well get comfortable. There's a shower in there. Why don't you shower, get cleaned up, wash your hair, you'll feel better, because you're going to be here for days. After a while, Reuben finally decided that was a good idea, so he went in, got in the shower, and got cleaned up, had just gotten dressed and had come out, and all of a sudden his brother came into the room. He had flown up from California. He put his arm around Reuben and said, Noe's name is in multiple temples on the prayer rolls. We have to have faith. They were quietly visiting next to Noe at the bedside. It had been a day since they'd given him the blessing. And all of a sudden they noticed him start to stir. Just slight movements. And then suddenly his eyes popped open, bright and clear. Reuben looked at his son and said, are you okay? And Noe said, yes. He said, are you in pain? And Noe said, no pain. The nurse came in while they were talking and turned and ran out of the room to get the doctor. He took his time and he came back in. I think he was probably doubting the nurse's observation. And when he came in the room and saw Noe speaking with his uncle and his father, he goes, this is a miracle. This is a complete miracle. But there's a lot of questions. We don't know what's happened here. We need to do an MRI and see what damage has been done to his brain, because he's not going to be completely normal, ever. And Ruben said, well, I've already spent $40,000. What's $10,000 more? So they did the MRI, and then no word. Finally, after 4 hours, a doctor came in and he said, there's an area of Noe's frontal cortex that has severe tissue damage. We don't know what will happen with it, but it will be something he'll struggle with the rest of his life. It will affect his short-term memory and some of his cognitive skills. Ruben looked at the doctor and said, so what do we do now? And the doctor said, there's nothing we can do now. Ruben said, well, then we're checking out. And so a few hours later, they loaded Noe into the truck and they headed back to Ely. The doctors had told them that when they got to Ely, they needed to make an appointment with the local doctor and have him examine Noe. And they learned on doing this that a neurologist came to Ely every couple of weeks, so they made an appointment with him. He ordered another MRI. It had been 2 weeks since the first MRI. When they went to the office, the neurologist conducted a few tests. The one Noe remembers is that he had to say the months of the year backwards starting in December, and that he missed September. The doctor told him that was fairly normal, that pretty much everyone missed a month when they tried to do that. So you can try that at home. But Noe told me that a few months after the incident, he got up early one morning and saw a beautiful sunrise. I had asked him if he remembered anything about the time he was unconscious. He said no, but the morning I saw that sunrise, it stirred a memory in me of something I had seen while I was unconscious. It was a bright, colorful sky filled with stars, and I had a reverent feeling. I was in a powerful, loving presence, a higher power, something that I didn't understand, but I felt completely at peace. And that's the only time he's had any recollection. When he got back to school that fall, Noe is a very private, quiet young man. He's a great guy. It was wonderful to get to know him. And he was surprised to be nominated and then win as homecoming king for Ely High School. But the kids could see that he was not your normal high school senior. After he finished high school, his mother felt like he had to go to college. She had to keep him close. So he did 1 quarter of college, and then he got his mission papers, and he submitted them. And they assumed, since he spoke Spanish, that he'd probably go to a Spanish-speaking mission somewhere. But he was called to the Hungary mission. He had to learn one of the most difficult languages in the world, Hungarian. He served an honorable mission. He came home. He was married in the temple. He has a beautiful family. And he is a fine, fine man. Moroni and Adan also both served faithful missions. And the scouts from the troop in Ely, Nevada that were at Lake Mead that day served missions. Aaron Hansen asked me to share 3 things that he had learned from this experience. And again, Aaron Hansen did not want to share this. He rarely talks about this. And I convinced all these people to share this story with you because it's a wonderful story. He said, number 1, you don't have to be perfect to call on the powers of heaven. He pointed out that that morning they had broken the rules of scouting and left the boys alone while the leaders had gone out to play. And then he said, number 2, this miracle was a function of Noe's obedience and faith. And number 3, he was struck with the ability of our youth to respond during catastrophic struggles with confidence and faith. I hope you enjoyed this story. The people of Ely, Nevada know about it, but I felt like it was the story we all needed to hear. I had heard about it from my son-in-law and my daughter. They are also quite hesitant to talk about it. So I had to coax everyone to share this with me. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks for watching. This has been Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. Please subscribe. Here's another story you might like. If you like that story, you can listen to all Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. Thanks again.